December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning sky was clear, painted in gold by the Pacific sun. Within minutes, it turned black. Japanese dive bombers shrieked from the clouds like iron hawks, their shadows slicing across the calm harbor. Battleship Arizona erupted in a tower of fire. The sea boiled with burning oil. Sailors dove into the flames, the air filled with screams, sirens, and the crack of exploding ammunition. By 10 a.m., the pride of the U.S. The Pacific Fleet lay shattered. 8 battleships crippled or sunk. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed, over 2,000 men dead. Across the ocean, in Tokyo, Japan's admirals watched the radio reports with grim satisfaction. Their gamble had worked. America's rusty buckets, as they called them, had been turned into scrap in a single morning. Champagne was poured. Laughter echoed in the war rooms. They believed the Pacific now belonged to them, that the American fleet was finished before the war had truly begun. But beneath the smoldering wreckage of Pearl Harbor, a different fire had been lit, not of oil or steel, but of resolve. A vow whispered among the ruins. The United States Navy would rise again. In the late 1930s, the Pacific Ocean was already a chessboard of ambition. Japan's empire, hungry for resources, stretched its reach across East Asia, seizing Manchuria in 1931, waging war in China by 1937, and eyeing the rich oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. The rising sun on their flag symbolized more than pride. It was a declaration of expansion. But every empire meets resistance. The United States, still emerging from the Great Depression, had begun to awaken to the threat. Washington condemned Japan's brutality in China and imposed restrictions on materials vital to Tokyo's war machine: steel, aviation fuel, and most crucially, oil. For a nation whose navy and air force depended entirely on imported fuel, the embargo was a strangling hand. By mid-1941, Japanese leaders faced an impossible choice: retreat from conquest or fight the industrial giant of the West. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, knew the odds. He had studied in the United States, understood its vast industrial might, and privately feared what a long war would bring. Yet the militarists around him, confident, zealous, and increasingly desperate, demanded a preemptive blow that would cripple America before it could respond. The plan that emerged was audacious. Japan would strike first and strike hard, destroying the U.S. Pacific Fleet at anchor in Hawaii, buying time to secure its greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The idea was simple and brutal. If the sword of the Pacific could be shattered in one morning, the United States would never rise again. In naval circles across Tokyo, the arrogance was palpable. Japan's navy was considered among the finest in the world, sleek, modern, battle-tested. Its ships gleamed under the rising sun, crewed by men who had fought in China and trained with relentless precision. The United States, by comparison, seemed sluggish and outdated. Japanese officers mocked the old American battleships anchored at Pearl Harbor, calling them floating museums, relics from another era, crewed by men too soft to fight a Pacific war. In November 1941, 6 carriers of the Kido Butai quietly assembled in the remote northern bays of Japan. Each was armed with aircraft designed to strike deep and fast. The pilots rehearsed endlessly: torpedo runs, bombing formations, deck coordination. Every movement was planned down to seconds. No nation had ever attempted an operation of such scale across an ocean. While diplomats still exchanged messages in Washington, the fleet sailed east through stormy seas, silent and unseen. The Japanese commanders believed that once Pearl Harbor was destroyed, America would lose its will to fight, that the humiliation would be too great, the rebuilding too slow. In their war councils, some laughed openly at the thought of America trying to rebuild its fleet of rusty buckets. They were confident not only in their ships, but in their spirit. The Japanese warrior ethos Bushido exalted sacrifice and loyalty. Many officers saw Western democracy as weak, corrupt, and unfit for war. Japan, they believed, would rule the Pacific as naturally as the sun ruled the sky. But behind the discipline and ceremony, Yamamoto remained uneasy. In a letter before the attack, he warned a close friend, "I shall run wild for 6 months after that. I have no expectation of success." He understood what his peers ignored, that America's strength lay not just in ships, but in industry, ingenuity, and willpower. Yet on that December morning, as flames devoured Battleship Row, even Yamamoto could not deny what he had achieved. The Imperial Navy had struck the most devastating first blow in modern history. Japan's admirals believed they had rewritten the rules of war, but in reality, they had awakened a sleeping giant. And across the Pacific, the giant was beginning to stir in shipyards, factories, and hearts filled with vengeance. The smoke over Pearl Harbor lingered for days. Oil slicks drifted across the harbor's surface, shimmering with the colors of ruin. Divers worked in silence beneath the waves, searching for trapped men cutting through twisted steel. In those early hours of December 8th, the United States stood stunned not just by the scale of the loss, but by the humiliation of it. Newspapers screamed of betrayal. Civilians queued to enlist. Across the Pacific, Japanese naval officers celebrated in the glow of triumph. They had destroyed or crippled 8 battleships, smashed America's Pacific defenses, and cleared the path for conquest. The Imperial Navy swept southward like a tide, seizing the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and Singapore. The laughter inside Tokyo's naval headquarters was unrestrained. Admiral Nagumo's task force returned as heroes. Japanese propaganda called the attack the dawn of the new empire. Newspapers mocked America's outdated warships, the Nevada, Oklahoma, and West Virginia, calling them rusty relics of the old world. In their arrogance, Japanese planners believed the United States could not recover. Their intelligence estimates suggested it would take years for the U.S. Navy to rebuild if it ever could. They imagined America's shipyards idle, its citizens demoralized, its leaders too cautious for total war. But that miscalculation would cost them everything. Within weeks, the very industrial machine Japan dismissed as clumsy and inefficient began to roar to life. Across the American mainland, the sleeping giant stirred exactly as Yamamoto had feared. In San Francisco, Oakland, and Seattle, cranes swung over dry docks 24 hours a day. Sparks flew from welding torches, illuminating the faces of thousands of new workers, men and women alike. Factories that once built cars now built tanks, planes, and engines for ships. In the shipyards of Virginia, New York, and California, new hulls rose from the water faster than any navy had imagined possible. America was not rebuilding the past. It was constructing the future. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, addressing Congress, called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Yet behind those words was not despair, it was resolved. He ordered an all-out mobilization of manpower and industry. The U.S. The Navy shifted from reliance on battleships to a new doctrine centered around aircraft carriers, the very weapon Japan had used to destroy them. In months, the shipyards launched new Essex-class carriers, modern cruisers and destroyers equipped with radar, a technology that Japan's admirals still underestimated. Behind every ship lay a story of adaptation. Engineers learned from Pearl Harbor's wreckage, improving compartmentalization, anti-aircraft defenses, and coordination between sea and air forces. While Japan celebrated its short-lived victories, America was learning, studying, evolving. Intelligence officers began deciphering Japanese codes. The Pacific Fleet's command structure shifted under the calm yet determined leadership of Admiral Chester Nimitz, who took command at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. When he first arrived, the harbor still smelled of smoke and oil, yet Nimitz saw not ruins but potential. He told his officers, "Those ships will fight again," and they did. One by one, vessels once thought lost were raised, patched, and sent back to sea. The Nevada, beached during the attack, was refloated and repaired. West Virginia returned years later, stronger than before. America's shipyards turned despair into momentum. In Tokyo, Japan's admirals mistook this silence for surrender. Confident that their 6 months of domination would become permanent, they pushed deeper into the Pacific toward Midway, toward the Aleutians, toward destiny. They believed the rising sun would never set on their navy. But even as they advanced, new American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were gathering strength. In them burned a purpose forged from loss. The empire that laughed at rusty buckets had yet to realize it had lit the furnace of its own destruction, and that fire was now spreading through factories, shipyards, and hearts that no longer feared defeat. In 1941, Japan's admirals believed their navy was unmatched. They were right, but only for a moment. Their carriers, planes, and battleships were the most advanced afloat. Yet what they could not anticipate was how quickly America would out-innovate them. At Pearl Harbor, the United States had relied on outdated doctrines, battleships as kings of the sea, carriers as mere scouts. The attack shattered that illusion. From its ashes emerged a revolution in naval warfare. The carrier would become the new flagship of power. By 1942, American engineers and naval strategists were racing to refine every detail of maritime combat. Radar, once experimental, became indispensable. With it, U.S. ships could detect enemy aircraft and surface threats long before they appeared visually. In the night battles around Guadalcanal, this edge proved decisive. Japanese ships, relying only on spotters and night optics, often sailed blind into radar-guided ambushes. Then came aircraft design. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, introduced in 1943, became the workhorse of the Pacific skies. Built rugged, powerful, and easy to fly, it was tailored for survival, the very opposite of Japan's fragile but nimble Zero. By the war's midpoint, the Hellcat achieved a kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese fighters. American torpedoes, early failures though they were re-engineered for reliability and precision. Naval gunnery adopted radar-assisted fire control, giving destroyers the ability to hit targets in darkness or storm. Submarines, once peripheral, now stalked Japanese convoys with ruthless efficiency, choking off the Empire's supply lines. Behind each of these advances stood a quiet transformation in mindset from shock to systematic problem-solving. The same engineers who had built civilian aircraft before the war now poured their expertise into creating tools of vengeance. Every failure became a lesson, every loss at sea, a new line of blueprints. The Japanese High Command mocked this process, at first believing America's technological obsession reflected weakness, a reliance on machines instead of spirit. But by 1943, that weakness had become America's greatest weapon. For Japan, the war had begun with swords sharpened by pride. For America, it became a war of steel sharpened by science. If technology reshaped how America fought, industry determined whether it could fight at all. And it was here in the roaring furnaces and crowded assembly lines that the true scale of Japan's miscalculation became apparent. In 1942, Japan's total naval construction capacity equaled that of a few major U.S. shipyards combined. Its resources, steel, oil, and manpower, were finite and stretched thin across its empire. The United States, meanwhile, was just beginning its industrial awakening. From Detroit to Philadelphia, entire cities transformed overnight into engines of war. Ford built bombers instead of cars. Bethlehem Steel rolled armor plates instead of bridges. Women filled the factories, their hands welding hulls and riveting decks. Posters declared, "You build it, they'll sail it." The numbers were staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. Navy commissioned over 200 major warships and tens of thousands of support vessels. Japan could not match even a fraction of that pace. American shipyards launched a new Liberty ship every 4 days, new Essex-class carriers every few weeks. Each ship that slid down the ways was a message: silent, heavy, unstoppable. This was the strength Yamamoto had feared. Not the ships themselves, but the endless capacity to replace them. For every carrier lost, 2 more would soon leave the dry dock. For every aircraft destroyed, another factory rolled out replacements. When Japanese admirals scoffed at America's rusty buckets, they misunderstood what they were seeing. Those ships were not symbols of decay, but foundations, hulls from which a new generation of war machines would rise. By 1943, the balance had begun to shift. Where once Japan's flagships had ruled the Pacific, now convoys of American warships crossed it daily, armed with better radar, stronger armor, and an industrial will that could not be bombed or burned. The laughter that once filled Tokyo's war rooms was replaced by reports grim, factual, undeniable. The Americans were not only rebuilding, they were accelerating, and as Japan's fleet stretched thinner, its factories strangled by blockade, one truth became clear. This was no longer a war of admirals. It was a war of machines and manpower, of time and steel. And time, at last, was no longer on Japan's side. In war, steel and fire decide battles, but men decide wars. After Pearl Harbor, the American fleet was not only damaged, it was leaderless, uncertain, and humiliated. It needed a new face, someone who could turn chaos into direction. That man was Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. When Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, He looked out over a harbor still choked with wreckage and oil. His task seemed impossible, yet his first act was symbolic. He moved his headquarters aboard a submarine tender rather than the safe distance of a mainland office. He wanted to be close to the sailors, to the wrecks, to the smell of the war. He brought calmness, discipline, and a belief in quiet efficiency. Unlike his Japanese counterparts, who relied on ceremony and tradition, Nimitz trusted intelligence, technology, and the initiative of his subordinates. He reorganized the Pacific Fleet around aircraft carriers, giving them tactical freedom that Japanese command structures could never match. Alongside him stood Admiral William Bull Halsey, a man of fire and instinct. If Nimitz was the steady hand, Halsey was the clenched fist. His orders were blunt, his language coarse, his presence electric. To the men who had survived Pearl Harbor, Halsey's aggression was more than strategy. It was vengeance given voice when he said, "Hit hard, hit fast, hit often." It became the creed of the fleet, and behind them, the calculating mind of Admiral Raymond Spruance shaped the precision of America's carrier tactics. Cool under pressure, methodical, and fiercely intelligent, Spruance turned chaos into choreography at sea. Together, these men represented the new spirit of American command, coordinated, rational, and adaptive. Japan's admirals, confident in past glories, had underestimated not only America's machines but its minds. While Yamamoto sought a single decisive victory to end the war, Nimitz and his team fought a series of battles designed to bleed Japan dry inch by inch, island by island, until there was nowhere left to run. They understood what the Japanese did not, that victory would not come from pride, but from persistence. If leadership gave the fleet direction, emotion gave it purpose. Pearl Harbor was not just an attack, it was an awakening. Across the United States, the image of burning battleships seared itself into the national memory. Posters declared, "Remember Pearl Harbor," and it became more than a slogan. It was a wound turned into fuel. Every sailor, every worker, every pilot carried it inside them. For the men who manned the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, vengeance was not born of hatred but of duty to the comrades left entombed beneath the waters of Hawaii. When the carriers launched the Doolittle raid in April 1942, bombing Tokyo for the first time, it was not for tactical gain. It was psychological retribution. The message was clear. America could strike back. Japan's admirals had imagined a defeated enemy too soft to endure hardship. What they did not understand was that democracy, once united by outrage, could summon endurance beyond any empire's imagination. While Japanese morale began to erode under endless strain and losses, American spirit only hardened. The Pacific War became personal, its sailors fighting not just for territory but for memory, for pride, for those still sleeping beneath the waves at Pearl Harbor. Pilots decorated their planes with the words, "For Arizona," "For West Virginia," "For Oklahoma." When they dove against enemy ships, they carried the ghosts of that day with them. Japan's officers spoke of honor. America spoke of the promise of return, of justice, of making right what was wrong. And as the months passed, that emotion translated into momentum. The fear that had filled Pearl Harbor in 1941 was gone by 1942. In its place stood something colder, sharper and unstoppable: determination. By the time the fleets faced each other again at Midway, the laughter that had once filled Tokyo's halls had turned into silence. Because now, for the first time, Japan's admirals would face not the old rusty buckets, but a navy reborn commanded by leaders who would not yield, and manned by sailors who had already lived through hell once, and they were coming for revenge. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy prepared for what it believed would be the final act of its dominance. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, confident from months of sweeping victories, set in motion Operation MI, the invasion of the small atoll of Midway, 2,300 miles northwest of Honolulu. The plan was to lure what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a trap, crush it completely, and end America's ability to project power in the Pacific. To Japan's admirals, this battle was the victory parade they had earned. To the Americans, it would become Pearl Harbor's revenge. But what Yamamoto didn't know was that his every move was already being read. In a nondescript building in Pearl Harbor, a small group of U.S. naval intelligence officers stationed hypo led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken Japan's naval code, Yen 25. By late May 1942, they knew Japan's next target was AF, which they confirmed to be Midway through a brilliant deception, sending a fake message from the island that its water plant had broken down, then intercepting a Japanese transmission reporting, AF is short on water. With that single piece of evidence, the trap turned on its creator, Admiral Chester Nimitz, armed with intelligence Yamamoto could only dream of, positioned his limited fleet for an ambush. He had just 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown against Japan's 4 elite carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Americans were outnumbered, but this time they were not blind. At dawn on June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft struck Midway's defenses, unaware that high above the Pacific, American carriers were launching their own counterattack. The first waves of U.S. torpedo bombers were slaughtered. Pilots from Hornet and Enterprise flew low and slow, facing the withering fire of Japanese Zeros. Entire squadrons were wiped out, but their sacrifice pulled the enemy's fighters down to sea level, leaving the skies above open a fatal mistake. At 10:22 a.m., American dive bombers, guided by luck and timing, appeared over the Japanese fleet. In a matter of minutes, the Pacific's balance of power was rewritten. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers, were engulfed in fire. Bombs tore through their flight decks, igniting fuel and ammunition. Flames raced through hangars filled with armed aircraft. Japanese sailors leapt into the sea as explosions split the decks open. By afternoon, the 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a desperate counterattack, damaging the Yorktown. But her fate was sealed. Later that day, American bombers found her too, and turned her into another burning wreck. When the smoke cleared, 4 Japanese carriers lay on the bottom of the Pacific, the same 4 that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. For the first time since 1941, the rising sun was eclipsed. The psychological shock in Tokyo was immeasurable. Japan had lost not just ships, but its most skilled aviator veterans who could never be replaced. The backbone of the Imperial Navy's striking force was gone. Yamamoto, stunned by the speed of the defeat, ordered a retreat. The plan that was meant to crush America had instead crippled Japan. News of the victory spread slowly at first, cloaked in secrecy. But when it reached the American public, it was received not with celebration, but with quiet, solemn pride. Every sailor knew what it meant. The debt of Pearl Harbor had begun to be repaid. In Tokyo, the same admirals who had once laughed at America's rusty buckets now faced a reality they had never imagined. A nation that could outthink, outbuild, and outfight them. Midway was more than a battle. It was the moment arrogance met consequence. The sea that had once mirrored the rising sun now reflected the smoke of burning carriers. And from that smoke, the United States Navy began its relentless push across the Pacific, a campaign that would grind Japan's empire to dust. After Midway, the once invincible Imperial Japanese Navy was bleeding, not dead but mortally wounded. Yet Japan's leaders refused to accept the truth. They still held vast territories across the Pacific, and their army's banners flew over half of Asia. To them, Midway was a setback, not a disaster. They believed the Americans would hesitate, regroup, and delay. But Admiral Nimitz had no intention of pausing. The sleeping giant had fully awakened. By August 1942, U.S. Marines landed on a small jungle-covered island few had heard of, Guadalcanal. It was here on a 6-month stretch of hell that the United States and Japan began their brutal fight for control of the Pacific. At night, Japanese warships bombarded American positions with terrifying accuracy. Their gunners fired so often that sailors nicknamed the channel Iron Bottom Sound for the countless ships and men lost beneath its waves. Yet for every Japanese cruiser that struck, an American ship appeared to replace it. For every night raid, another convoy of supplies arrived from the east. The struggle for Guadalcanal revealed the new face of the U.S. Navy, resilient, adaptive, and relentless. The same radar Japan had once dismissed now guided destroyers in pitch-black battles. American pilots, flying rugged Wildcats and later Hellcats, learned to use their planes' strengths rather than match Japan's Zeros in agility. And slowly, inevitably, the tide turned. When Japan finally abandoned Guadalcanal in early 1943, it was more than a tactical withdrawal. It was the beginning of retreat itself. The myth of invincibility was broken. From there, the American advance accelerated. The Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas. Each step brought the U.S. Navy closer to Japan's homeland. Each battle tested new ships, new carriers, and new tactics refined by blood and calculation. By mid-1944, Japan's empire stretched thin and weary. Its shipyards could no longer replace what was lost. Fuel convoys from the Dutch East Indies were ravaged by American submarines. The once proud fleet that had sailed across the Pacific now struggled even to leave port. Then came the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1920. 1944, a confrontation so one-sided, it would forever be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft launched to strike the American fleet poorly trained, flying outdated planes running on dwindling fuel. Waiting for them were disciplined U.S. pilots guided by radar, flying Hellcats that cut through the sky like blades. The results were devastating. Nearly 400 Japanese planes were destroyed in a single day. Entire air groups wiped out. The Imperial Navy had lost its eyes. Without experienced pilots, Japan's magnificent ships were nothing more than targets, and still the Americans advanced. In October 1944, Japan gambled everything on one final confrontation, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history. Yamamoto was gone, killed by American interceptors the year before, but his successors clung to his old dream of a decisive victory. They sent everything that remained: carriers, battleships, destroyers, and a desperate armada to crush the U.S. landing forces in the Philippines. It was a battle fought across 400,000 square miles of ocean, involving hundreds of ships. At Surigao Strait, the U.S., the Navy executed a perfect ambush crossing the Japanese fleet's T, a maneuver out of naval legend. Radar-directed fire ripped through Japan's line. Yamashiro and Fuso went down in flames. In the Sibuyan Sea, American carrier aircraft pounded the super battleship Musashi, one of the heaviest ships ever built, until she sank beneath the waves. Off Samar, in a desperate counterattack, a handful of American escort carriers and destroyers fought back with such ferocity that even the Japanese commander, Vice Admiral Kurita, believed he was facing the main U.S. fleet and retreated. By the end of the battle, Japan's navy had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. 4 carriers, 3 battleships, and 10 cruisers were lost. The rest limped back to port, crippled and starving for fuel. The laughter that once echoed in Tokyo's war rooms had long vanished. What remained was disbelief and silence. The very fleet that had mocked America's rusty buckets was now a ghost, scattered across the Pacific floor. For the sailors who survived Pearl Harbor, the sight of burning Japanese ships was more than victory. It was redemption. For the first time in the war, the Pacific truly belonged to them. But beneath the triumph lay something quieter, deeper. The realization that this vengeance, though, just had come at an immense price in lives in oceans of fire and steel. Still, the vow made in the oil-slicked waters of Pearl Harbor had been fulfilled. The rising sun had set. And the Pacific, once Japan's empire, was now America's domain. When the smoke cleared over Leyte Gulf in late October 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer a fighting force. It was a shattered relic. What had begun at Pearl Harbor as a campaign of audacious domination ended in quiet ruin across the Pacific. Admiral Somu Toyota, now Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received fragmentary reports of the disaster. One after another, messages came through in broken code. Yamashiro lost Suikaku, burning Musashi, sunk Kurita, retreating. He understood immediately the fleet was finished. Japan's navy, once the most modern in Asia, was now reduced to a few battleships without fuel, a handful of carriers without planes, and airfields filled with empty hangars. The industrial miracle that had once produced warships faster than any other Asian nation was now buried under bombed-out factories and empty oil reserves. The loss of the Philippines meant something, even worse than lost territory. It severed the empire's supply lines. The oil fields of Borneo and the Dutch East Indies could no longer send fuel north. Without oil, ships were useless, planes were grounded, and the engines of war fell silent. By early 1945, The once proud combined fleet lay anchored in Japan's harbors immobile, starving and exposed. The great battleships Yamato and Nagato sat idle in Kure Bay, their hulls rusting, their crews reduced to half rations. The sailors trained every morning as if for battle, but they knew the truth. They would never again sail to victory. American bombers now roamed the skies unopposed. Carrier task forces struck Japan's coastal bases at will. Every dock, refinery, and depot burned beneath the constant rain of explosives. Japan's merchant fleet, the lifeline that kept the nation's factories alive, was systematically hunted down by American submarines. By the spring of 1945, 9 out of every 10 Japanese merchant ships had been sunk. Inside Tokyo, the mood was grim. The laughter that had once filled the war councils had turned into denial and despair. Senior admirals debated whether to hide the full scale of the losses from the emperor himself. Some still clung to fantasies of a decisive homeland defense, but they knew the reality. There would be no second Midway, no miraculous turnaround. The people, too, began to feel the weight of the empire's downfall. Rationing grew unbearable. Blackouts became a nightly ritual. Entire cities prepared for invasion. The once proud Japanese Navy, the instrument that had once carried Japan's flag across the Pacific, was now a silent witness to the nation's collapse. In the spring of 1945, as the Allies approached Okinawa, Japan decided on one final act of defiance, a mission that symbolized the end as much as it did resistance. The order went out: Operation Tengo. Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, would sail on a one-way mission to Okinawa. She carried barely enough fuel for a single trip, none to return. Her crew of 3,000 men knew what it meant: a suicide voyage. When American planes found her on April 7, 1945, the attack lasted barely 2 hours. Bomb after bomb, torpedo after torpedo struck the giant ship until a final explosion split her in two. The mushrooming column of smoke could be seen 100 miles away. It was not just the death of a battleship. It was the death of the Imperial Japanese Navy itself. For those who had laughed at the rusty buckets of America in 1941, there was nothing left to laugh about now, only the distant thunder of American bombers and the silence of empty harbors. The sea that once gave Japan power had now become the boundary of its defeat. By mid-1945, Japan stood isolated, cut off from the resources that once fueled its empire, surrounded by a ring of American steel and fire. The once proud Imperial Navy was no longer a shield. It was a ghost. In the final months of the war, Japanese naval air units existed mostly on paper. Training schools, once filled with elite aviators, were reduced to desperate teenagers rushed through brief instruction before being sent on suicide missions. Fuel was so scarce that many pilots trained in wooden mock-ups instead of real aircraft. The proud doctrine of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, had turned into a desperate call for self-sacrifice. Kamikaze pilots, many of them former Navy cadets, volunteered to strike American carriers with their planes packed full of explosives. They took off knowing they would not return. From the decks of American ships, sailors watched in silence as these fiery comets streaked down from the sky, not with fear, but with a grim understanding. Japan's last defense was not strategy anymore. It was despair. The destruction of Japan's cities deepened that despair. Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama all turned to ash under relentless American bombing. The Navy could no longer protect even its homeland. Its harbors, once bristling with ships, became wreck-strewn graveyards. When U.S. forces invaded Okinawa in April 1945, Japan threw every remaining vessel it could find into the fight barges. Patrol boats, training ships, anything that could float. It changed nothing. The battle consumed over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors, and left the nation's last defenses in ruins. In July, when American carrier planes struck the Kure naval arsenal, Japan's most important base, they destroyed what little remained of the fleet. Haruna, Ise, and Hyuga, once proud battleships, were sunk where they lay anchored, unable to even fire back. That same month, Emperor Hirohito's naval staff compiled a secret report. It listed the surviving combat ships of the once mighty Imperial Navy. The document fits on a single sheet of paper. By August, when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan's naval officers knew the truth that politicians still avoided saying aloud. There was no fleet left to defend the nation. No carrier to retaliate, no hope of counterattack. On August 15, 1945, the Emperor's voice was faint, trembling, and the first the Japanese people had ever heard broke through the radio static. He announced the surrender. For many naval officers, that moment felt like the collapse of their entire world. At naval bases across the country, sailors stood in silence as the imperial flag was lowered. Some wept, others stared blankly at the sea. A few, unable to bear the shame, took their own lives beside the ships they had served on. Admiral Toyota, who had once commanded Japan's combined fleet, later admitted, "We fought a battle that could never be won. We had believed in spirit over steel. But war favors those who can endure, not those who can dream." In the months that followed, Allied teams began dismantling what was left of Japan's navy. Battleships were scuttled. Carriers were scrapped. Torpedoes were dumped into the sea. By 1947, not a single major Japanese warship remained in service. Across the Pacific, the United States Navy now reigned unchallenged. Its carriers, forged in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, had become the standard for modern naval warfare. From the ashes of humiliation, America had built a fleet that not only avenged its fallen but redefined the ocean's balance of power for generations. The rusty buckets once mocked in Tokyo had risen as floating fortresses of steel, while Japan's mighty navy faded into legend. And so, as the waters of the Pacific grew calm again, the laughter that once filled Japan's war rooms was replaced by silence. The silence of defeat and of lessons learned too late. In the years after the war, divers and fishermen still found fragments of Japan's vanished fleet, rusting hulls buried beneath coral, twisted guns pointing into eternal silence. The Pacific had become both witness and grave. For the men who survived it, the sea was no longer a place of glory. It was a reminder of how swiftly pride can sink beneath the weight of reality. The Imperial Navy, born from ambition and arrogance, had challenged a nation it thought weak and awakened an industrial giant that fought not for conquest, but for survival. In that clash, the very idea of naval warfare changed forever. Battleships gave way to carriers, strategy yielded to logistics, and the myth of invincibility, the belief that spirit alone could defeat steel, was drowned in the smoke of Midway. Guadalcanal and Leyte Gulf for America. Victory brought not just pride, but a sobering truth. That war, even when righteous, consumes everything it touches. From the oil fires of Pearl Harbor to the atomic glow over Hiroshima, vengeance had completed its cycle and left behind a silence too deep for celebration. For Japan, defeat forced a reckoning. The same nation that once built weapons of the empire turned its genius toward rebuilding, trade, and peace. Its shipyards, once devoted to war, would one day launch vessels carrying cars, technology, and aid across the same oceans once filled with fire. Today, when waves roll over the wrecks of Yamato and Zuikaku, they whisper a simple truth that the sea remembers, but it also forgives. The laughter that began this story, the mockery of rusty buckets, has long since faded into the deep. What remains is the quiet lesson beneath it all, that no power, no fleet, no empire can endure when it underestimates the resolve of a free people or the cost of its own pride. And so, the Pacific lies calm again. But beneath its surface, history sleeps waiting for those who dare to listen to the echoes of the past and remember what the sea once took.